15.
Let me begin by telling you the only untrue story I shall tell this evening. It's partially true. As many of you know, I spent almost 5 years in solitary confinement. When I came home, my wife said, "Oh, good to see you. I've been praying for you for 5 years." I said, "That's very nice of you." She said, "Yes, but you came back." That's not strictly true. I've been engaged in the work of seeking the release of people from illegal detention for many years, going back to the time when I lived in Africa during the Waite regime and had to have face-to-face dealings with General Amin, who had detained and in fact murdered many of my colleagues in Uganda. And I suppose that was the first time in my life as a young man when I came face to face with some of the real brutalities that exist in our world. I'd read about them, but there I came face to face with them and had to deal with them. And that led to my working in most of the conflict situations in the world, ranging from South America, the southern Philippines, and all places where there was conflict and war. And as almost everyone in this room will know, the principal victims of war and conflict are women and children, who suffer appallingly. The civilian population in warfare suffer appallingly. And I worked in that field for many years before being recruited to work as an ecclesiastical and political advisor to the Archbishop of Canterbury, Robert Runcie. I'm not a clergyman, and it always annoys me when people think I am a clergyman because I've had no desire at all to turn my collar round. But I've worked from a church base because a church base does provide an opportunity to work in some of the most troubled parts of the world. I've been interested tonight in listening to the excellent speakers that have been here, having worked very closely with Desmond Tutu in South Africa. And as I was saying to Craig, Svetlana Stalin, when she first came to this country, stayed with us in London while she attempted to settle a life that was truly disturbed and truly detrimentally affected, as one might expect, as a result of her own particular and peculiar upbringing. I became involved in hostage negotiation in Iran, having been in the Evin prison many times and brought people back from Iran, having negotiated directly with Colonel Gaddafi in Libya and brought people home from there, and also having been involved in Beirut, where I myself was captured. The story itself is long and complicated, but in short, one fell a victim of political duplicity, a political duplicity played out by the government of the United States of America. As an independent and humanitarian negotiator, you do face extreme difficulty. On the one hand, you wish to cooperate with those who are seeking the release of innocent people. That means you have a degree of relationship with various intelligence agencies. On the other hand, you're extremely cautious because you know, if you've any political savvy at all, that those who are engaged in the work of government will often have another political agenda around and centered around hostage cases. And they would be playing out that agenda. They would be saying in public, yes, of course, we want the release of these innocent people, and in part they do. but there will be another agenda. And often that's unknown to you. Almost all the time that's unknown to you. And therefore, you're extremely cautious as to what you communicate and how close you get to those who are working from government sources. But there comes a time when inevitably you perhaps step over a mark, trust that you've established with the kidnappers is compromised, and you're hauled in, as I was in Beirut. I was the only person at all from the West to have face-to-face meeting with the kidnappers of the Western hostages in Beirut, and had established a degree of trust and was working on an agenda which would have led to the release of more people had it been possible to follow it through. I was only able to bring 2 hostages out before the political axe fell. I was promised safe conduct to go and see hostages who were sick and ill, John McCarthy, Brian Keenan, Terry Anderson, the AP journalist. And I had to make a decision at a time of great political difficulty, centered around what became known as a rencontre, something that is an interesting discussion and lecture in itself. And I had to decide whether or not I should go for that meeting with kidnappers, knowing that I was surrounded by this awful furore rencontre. If anybody ever stands on a public platform, as I'm standing tonight, and tells you that they're full of altruism, I think you're entitled to be somewhat cynical. I certainly am not full of altruism, because I recognize that you don't, most of us, when we engage in works to alleviate the suffering of others, are doing also something for ourselves. There's nothing wrong in that. And when I was presented with the opportunity to see sick and ill people, I said to myself, well, if you don't take it, and one of those men dies, and you haven't had the courage of your conviction to go and see them, then you'll have to live with your conscience for the rest of your life. And I wasn't prepared for that. So I went. And to cut a long story short, I found myself in a cell deep underground, a cell that was tiled. And my blood ran cold at that point, because I realized that these cells are tiled because they're easier to clean after people have been knocked around. It was an eerie place. There were about 5 other cells, absolutely silent, beneath the car park of a building. Above the car park was a block of flats, an apartment block. And the cells had their own generator, their own very primitive toilet, and one had to keep absolute silence. I was very angry. I was angry with myself for taking such a risk, and I was, of course, angry with my captors. And I did what many, many people do when they first experience incarceration. I determined to show that I still had a degree of freedom. And so I refused all food. I said, I'm not going to eat. And I didn't eat for a week. And at the end of the week, they said, if you don't eat now, we shall make you eat. And by then, my anger had dissipated and I ate. There's just one small point I'd make at this juncture and say, anger, of course, is a normal, natural human emotion. We all experience it from time to time. I think it's wise not to allow anger to turn to bitterness, because bitterness really is like a cancer that enters the soul. It does more harm to those who hold it than against those whom it's held. And I can genuinely say I didn't allow anger to turn to bitterness, although I felt anger. I was moved from time to time, and the first year I was interrogated. Interrogation accompanied by torture, which was mercifully certainly not as severe as many people who have experienced torture, and experienced torture, the latest round being, of course, in Guantanamo Bay. I was simply beaten on the feet with cable so that I couldn't walk for weeks after that. And that's one of the reasons why eventually I found myself in much less severe circumstances in Headley Court a number of years later. I also faced a mock execution when the gun was put to my head and I was told that I was to die. Again, a frightening experience. I wasn't afraid of death as such, but I didn't want to die in those circumstances. I didn't want to die without my family and friends knowing how I had spent my last years and in what frame of mind I was. I was then eventually told, because they were interrogating me as to my knowledge of Iran-Contra, about which I knew nothing. I was then told I was going to be freed, and I was put into private accommodation for a week, where conditions improved, and at the end of the week, I was told that I was not going to be freed, and I was put back into normal hostage accommodation for another 4 years. I think I understand why that happened. I won't say publicly because I can't be absolutely sure, but I think I know why I was not released at that stage. To be in extreme solitary confinement is a hard experience. I was blindfolded, or had to pull a blindfold over my eyes when anyone came into the room. I was chained by hands and feet to the wall for 23 hours and 50 minutes a day. I slept on the floor on a very thin mattress with a blanket, so I was freezing in the winter and boiling in the summer. The room was normally in darkness. If I was in an upstairs room in an upper building where it had been bombed out, metal shutters were put in front of the window, so there was no natural light. Sometimes I had electric light, but it failed frequently in Beirut. Sometimes a candle, and most of the time nothing. No books or papers for over 3.5 years. No companionship, no one to speak with. My guards wouldn't exchange conversation with me because I used to say to them initially, does it not say in the Quran you should not steal? They said, yeah. I said, how is it you steal me from my family? You steal my freedom. They said, we'll go and ask the chef about that, the chef being the chief. They came back a couple of weeks later. I said, well, what did the chief say? They said, the chief said, we mustn't speak to you anymore. So I got no further with that particular one. But you see your skin go white because there's no natural light. You lose muscle tone because there's no exercise. My beard, which used to be black, grew long and white. And I remember thinking that I was getting old before my time. And as I, saw my physical body begin to deteriorate rather more rapidly than I hoped for, I wondered if I would fragment mentally and spiritually. And I became frightened about that, and I realized that I had to do something about it because I'd read stories of people being kept in isolation for years. When they came out as gibbering idiots, unable to string 2 sentences together. And I wondered if that was an inevitable consequence of being kept in conditions of that kind. One way in which I coped with the situation was to decide to take an interior journey, because all life had to be lived from within. Gone are my days of travel, gone are my days of seeing the sky, of feeling the wind on my face, of walking with friends. They were all gone. Now all I had was my interior life. And so I took that journey to get to know myself better. That was also another way of self-preservation, because one has to find one's center. I do a lot of work these days with the homeless, and homeless people are often kicked around. They're regarded as worthless. I know that feeling. I know what it is and how easy it is to become dispirited and to lose your identity and to feel as though you are not worth anything. So somehow in isolation one has to take hold and find your center and hold on to it. Be self-centered in the best possible sense of that word. I began to write in my head. The book, Taken on Trust, was actually written in my head during those years. I had no pencil and paper at all, except on 2 occasions. Once when I was told I could write a letter when I was about to be executed, or so I thought, and on one other occasion, which I'll tell you about in a moment. And I wrote that book then, and if you have ever read it, you'll notice that it moves backward and forward in time. It doesn't follow a sequence from birth to death to life today, so to speak. It moves backward and forward as the mind moves in time. So the book moves, attempts to move with it and attempts to recapture that experience. The danger, of course, of taking an extensive and intensive inner journey is that you discover, quite understandably, that you're a composite mixture of both light and dark. Some call it good and evil, whatever you will. And the danger, of course, is that when you come across the dark side of character, which is in all of us, you can be over-depressed and fall into depression. One has to guard against that and simply recognize that one is just along with everybody else, a normal human being, with a dark and a light side. And the idea is not simply to walk completely in the light, which is an impossibility in my view, but to somehow try and find inner harmony and inner balance and grow into that greater inner harmony, which of course is a lifelong process. Talking about pencil and paper, one of the more amusing stories of captivity was when I used to ask my guards for books, and they wouldn't bring me books. They said they'd never read a book in their life. But one found a sympathetic guard, and one day he brought me a book. And I got it this way. He had to work through a series of cutouts. And he said he'd get me one. When he brought the book down by my side, I laughed out loud because, unknown to himself, he brought me Great Escapes by Eric Williams. When he brought me a manual of breastfeeding, I really despaired. It wasn't even illustrated, it was a But he did try. I want to, my time is up. There are many more things to say. Simply 2 things. I eventually came out after many more experiences, which would take too long to relate. But I went founded Hostage UK, went to see Mrs. Bigley, the mother of Ken Bigley, who was brutally beheaded. And I went to see her at that time, and I sat on the end of her bed. She's an old lady who lived in a 2 up and 2 down in Liverpool. And the news came through that her son had died in that particular way. And she said to me, she said, you know, nothing can explain how I feel at this time. And then she said something truly profound. She said, but my suffering is no different than the suffering of a mother in Iraq or Afghanistan who's lost a child. I thought that was a remarkable statement coming from a little lady in Liverpool who had experienced that with her son. And I conclude, if I may, by just reading you briefly a poem I wrote recently, which I think may explain something about the human condition and something about Amnesty too. Within my soul lies a hidden place, a place of longing, longing to be free from hurt and that which would destroy. Deep within there is a wound, always protected and guarded from all, excepting those whom I love, who carry within their own pain. Deep within, in the mystery of unconscious life, I know the secret you. I know your inner longing, your inner pain. For one brief moment, deep within, we embrace, and then we are gone. The encounter reveals my incompleteness, my fragile existence. We cannot heal each other from the human condition. But in one brief moment, we embrace and touch the hem of wholeness. And I'm proud to be associated with Amnesty, because Amnesty embraces the suffering in the world, and in so doing, touches the hem of wholeness. Thank you very much.